became clear to my two guests about 9 months on into the pandemic that something was wrong, that what we knew already about the pandemic and about the spread of the COVID virus wasn't being reflected in government policy and reaction to the virus. And they wrote a book. And now, 3 years out, they've updated their book, and it is, according to the copy they gave me, 530 pages, so Bible-sized. And so I thought I would have them on the show today to discuss what has updated in the book since, what they've discovered, looking back in retrospect. So joining me now are Dr. Barry Cooper and Marco Navarro-Genie. Marco is the president of the Haltine Institute, and I would like them to discuss their book. It's called Canada's COVID, the Story of a Pandemic Moral Panic. And this is, like I said, the updated version. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me on Ezra's show. I guess we'll go back a little. What prompted the authoring of the first book? And jump in, whichever one of you wants to answer.
Marco, you go first.
Okay, I'll do it. Hello, and thank you for having us, Sheila. This is great to see you again. We both have similar and at the same time differing concerns when we started looking at this. My very own was, to tell you the truth, fear. At the beginning, I started to see the images coming in from the Far East, from Iran, from Italy, and thought, my goodness, what's going to happen to my children? Right. So that was kind of and then so I started looking at the data. I started reading some of the medical journals and looking at mortality rates and things like that. One of the things that struck me as absolutely fearful, and at the same time, quickly I found out that it was wrong, is that we were comparing it to the Spanish flu, so that we were going to have proportions of death, people dying on the streets like we did, 100 and some years ago. And it pretty quickly became evident that the story that was being peddled through the media and the actual reality were completely different. And so part of the motivation was to square the circle in that sense, but also because it pretty quickly became evident to both of us when we sort of started talking that there were sets of people or groups of people, including politicians and doctors and bureaucrats, who were more than willing to take advantage of the situation to increase essentially their standing and their power.
So I guess that takes me into my next question. I'll pose it to Barry, although I think Marco answered it in part. Why did they whip up this hysteria? What to what end?
One of the things that one of the ways we approached this was from a French philosopher, a guy named Michel Foucault, who's normally not associated. He's associated with sort of left-wing ways of looking at politics, postmodernism, and all that stuff. But he developed this notion of what he called power and knowledge. And that struck me almost immediately. I wrote a book on Foucault years ago, and it struck me just listening to the things that particularly the health care professionals, so-called, in the med school here from Edmonton, Dina Henshaw in particular, the remarkably misleading statements coming out of Ottawa with our Canada's chief doctor and so on. It struck me that they must have known that they were not telling the whole truth. So what Foucault's ways of looking at them taught me, was it's all about power. Why do people want power? That's the question you're asking. And this is something that political scientists have been concerned about since the beginning of political science, quite frankly. So those are the kind of questions that we were interested in. We had to read a lot of epidemiology and a lot of med-sci stuff to make sense of the mendacious, misleading statements of our public health officials. But these are not. It may be difficult to do medical science. It's not difficult to understand when you read the results. You can, normal people can understand this stuff. And there was a huge amount of controversy that was completely ignored by public health officials in order to peddle this narrative that we're all in terrible danger. We're all going to die. Get vaxxed, do this, do that, lockdown. And it struck us both pretty quickly that this was just a ploy to ensure that they were not questioned.
Yeah, we didn't ever really hear from our chief medical officers of health, particularly here in Canada, unless it was Dina Hinshaw warning us about the dangers of STDs during the stampede. Like, you never heard from the woman before. And then all of a sudden, she's the star of her own show every night on the dinner hour, warning us about, death counts and infection rates. And I think some people really got addicted to the fame of it all, but I also think people got addicted to the money. There were a lot of, I want to call them maybe crisis entrepreneurs, the same people who jack up the price of bottled water during a hurricane. Those people came out of the woodwork to all of a sudden enrich themselves with government contracts, peddling, being the third person in the contract, dealing PPE all of a sudden, or getting contracts to create ventilators when they had no history or expertise in the medical system, but all of a sudden they were stepping up to be the saviors during the pandemic.
Yeah, that was particularly true next door in BC, where Dina Hinshaw is now apparently employed.
Fancy that.
Yeah. And there, the chief medical officer of health had the imprudence to actually write a book about it. And if you read the book, it's a kind of confession that I really enjoy this. I like people doing what I tell them. This is a quote, she called it a whole of government approach. In other words, she was telling the government of BC what to do. And I'm sure it went to her head. It had to. The same thing happened with lesser lights in the med school at the U of C. I could tell just from watching some of these guys on television, they were really enjoying it. I mean, I don't mind going on TV, but I don't get a charge out of it anymore. Like, maybe the first time it was a big thrill, but now it's just, part of your, I don't know, duty almost. But those guys were just having a hell of a good time.
Yeah, it's evident, right, that people who work in an office, hopefully with windows, but not all the time, suddenly have all these lights and all this attention, and they couldn't help themselves. I like your comparison to the entrepreneurs of bottled water and toilet paper. You remember that this whole thing started this panic about toilet paper and people sort of taking advantage, and it's really no difference. I mean, no different. If you look at, already, we found out much later how much money Ms. Hinshaw ended up gathering from all of this. And the entrepreneurial part is kind of set up, and this is kind of what sort of gave it away for me, is that the doctors were already in a dispute with the premier in Alberta. And so they took advantage of the situation to make themselves feel more needed than they normally would. Exhibit A, for example, the government of Alberta increased enormous amount of money is allocated to increase the number of beds for intensive care units, and that money was never put to use to increase the number of beds that was needed. So they were essentially choking the supply to make themselves feel better and more needed.
That was an excerpt from the Ezra Levant Show. I'm Ezra Levant. Every weekday, I do a monologue about the topic of the day. Then I interview a fascinating guest, either in studio or via Skype. And then I read your mail, whether it's fan mail or hate mail, which is sometimes even more interesting. This is on our premium service, though, called Rebel News Plus. Go to rebelnewsplus.com. It's $8 a month or less if you buy a whole year in advance. You get my show every weeknight, plus Sheila Gunn Reid's show every week. It's called The Gun Show. It's pretty amazing. We rely on you because we do not take a dime from the government. In Canada, that makes us almost unique. So please help us out and help yourself to some great journalism at rebelnewsplus.com.